You are listening to the Career Pathways podcast. As always, we're coming from the luxurious KILT studio in the basement of the Lion Library. And as always, behind the board, making the magic happen, is producer Jayson. Say hello, producer Jayson.
Hello.
Now, the filming on this may go in and out because he's on his phone watching the Masters.
No.
So we're
I would
so just be forewarned that you might have some blank spaces somewhere along there when he checks out to see what's going on in the world of golf. But today we have Professor Kieran O'Keefe. Hello, how are you, sir?
I'm good. Great to be here.
Yes, this is our first attempt at getting into the whole field of history. Kind of covered all points in between, but it's long overdue, and we look forward to having a conversation. First thing we always start with, Kieran, is just to have you tell us about yourself, kind of where you're from, where you went to school, and kind of what was the pathway that led you to Lyon College.
Yeah, so Kieran O'Keefe. I grew up in New York State, not New York City, which I find when you're not in the Northeast, people tend to kind of forget that there's another 90% of New York's geography that's not in New York City.
Right.
But I grew up maybe like an hour and a half north of New York City in the Hudson Valley, sort of halfway in between New York City and Albany, kind of close to West Point, which is probably the biggest, most famous thing around there that people would know outside the region. So I spent the first couple decades of my life there, went to college in that area, got my bachelor's degree at Mount St. Mary College, which is a small liberal arts college like Lyon College. In Newburgh, New York, and I majored in history and then had minors in political science and religious studies, actually. And then from there, I got my master's at the University of Vermont, up in Burlington, Vermont, actually not too far from the Canadian border. And then from there, I went to George Washington University, where I got my PhD.
Yep.
And my dissertation, which is kind of like the book you write when you to get your PhD, and that was on actually loyalists or colonists who supported the British in the Hudson Valley in the Revolutionary War. From there, had a 1-year postdoc at Siena College, which was back in New York, right outside Albany. And then from there, I came here, started in 2022. So at the end of my second year here at Lyon College.
Going to school, what kind of drew you to history and said, okay, this is kind of my place?
That's a good question. I always have a hard time answering that because I don't know if there was like one thing that drew me to history. I think the area I grew up in helped a bit because that area of the country is very historic. So I remember from the time I was a little kid, either going on field trips or my parents taking us places, going to like Washington's headquarters. George Washington had his headquarters in Newburgh, where I grew up. At least part of my life, I grew up there. Like the state historic site there, and then we weren't too far from FDR's home in Hyde Park, so I remember going on field trips there. West Point's obviously very historic. Yeah. And then actually while I was in high school, I started working at a place called the New Windsor Cantonment, which is about maybe 20, 25 minutes from where I was living. And that's actually where the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, camped during the last winter of the Revolutionary War. And so while Washington had his headquarters in Newburgh, which is like one town over, he had the army camped in New Windsor nearby. So actually they're both state historic sites for New York. And so my job there, which I worked at there for 8 years, was actually dressing up as a Revolutionary soldier, doing musket demonstrations, blacksmithing, medical demonstrations, giving tours of a historic house we ran. So that certainly helped me get into like the Revolutionary period. But I always just kind of liked hearing stories and putting things in context, because I think if you know history, it helps you understand the world so much better in a way that you don't if you don't have some kind of historical awareness. So like, there's always debates in like U.S. politics about, let's say, the Constitution, for example. How do we interpret the Constitution? What does this mean? What does that mean? What was the context in which this article of the Constitution was written in 1787? And we have a deep understanding of the early period of American history. It really helps you, gives you a new appreciation of that, and helps you, I think, address questions and problems much more effectively than you otherwise would if you didn't have the historical background.
What's your opinion when it comes to the Constitution and that body of thought that wants to be strictly originalist, and that because it's like 240 years. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, about that.
240 years ago, that was a different.
It's a different world.
Yeah, and now it's like, no, we have to follow exactly what the Constitution said.
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical of trying to solely follow the original meaning of the
Yeah.
language or what you think the original meaning is. And that's part of the problem is that historians could look at the Constitution and come to different ideas about what the framers meant in
Yeah.
individual sections or clauses within the Constitution. I also think you have to recognize that we're talking about a world which was wildly different than the world we live in today in many ways. It's not that there weren't some great ideas in the Constitution, but it goes without saying it's a world in which slavery still existed. It's a
Right.
world in which Native Americans were not considered equal to white
Yeah.
Americans, were deprived of their sovereignty. It's a world in which women didn't have anything resembling the political rights that women have today. And so I'm reluctant to interpret it entirely within the context of the 18th century.
Right.
Not that it can't help you inform your interpretation of it, but I'm more of the opinion it should be a living, breathing document, and we shouldn't be exclusively tied to what
Right.
we think people in the 18th century thought
Yeah.
about. It doesn't mean you go well beyond what the Constitution is saying, but I think there are a lot of problems with just interpreting
Right.
it as it was written in the 18th century.
Is there a specific, like with your focus being mostly around the Revolutionary War period, is there a specific like number of years or events that you really kind of do a deep dive and focus on?
I'd say the war years is what I know the best. So the
Yeah.
war begins in 1775, ends in 1783. I mean, the Revolutionary period lasts longer than that because there are the protests before the war.
Mhm.
There's the war itself. There's the kind of the struggle to create a new
Right.
system of government after the Revolutionary War. So in some ways, you could say the Revolutionary period goes from like 1763 to like the late 1780s. But the era I know the best for sure is the Revolutionary War. And I'd say in particular the war in New York, which
Yeah.
I studied the most. But I'd say the war as a whole is something what I know the best within that broader era.
With as a historian, are there still new things being uncovered? That it's like this has been studied by you and
Mhm.
many others, but I'm guessing that you still find
Yeah.
things in as far as document research or finding a new document somewhere that it just gives some new insight in terms of that period of history.
hmm Yeah, history is always changing, and the way the questions historians answer is always informed by the period they live in.
Yeah.
So, for example, for much of American history, there wasn't really much research on the experiences of Black Americans.
Right.
But starting in the Civil Rights era, in the 1960s, not coincidentally, you begin to see historians take an interest in that, and especially in recent years, there's been so much scholarship on the experiences of enslaved people and Black people more generally in the U.S. So the kind of questions historians are seeking to answer are always changing, and as a result, there's always new things to try to answer, new things to solve, and there are new documents that are found periodically, and and there's always new ways of approaching subjects. So things are always changing. History is not static.
I'm glad you brought that up because I had as a question last year. You gave a presentation on African Americans and the American Revolution,
hmm
and you kind of explored, what the experiences of Black Americans were during that Revolutionary era. What kind of insights did you find from that happened there? Was it like things that were new or what it was really like? Because I remember it was like we may think it's this, but
hmm
life actually was something different.
Well, I would say with African Americans and the Revolution, one of the things, I can just pick one topic and talk about that within
Yeah.
that broader field. But the role of like Black men in particular serving in the army, serving in the
Mhm.
armed forces, and helping win the war is something that is underappreciated by the American public at large. So if you look at how many Black men are serving in the army, it's quite substantial. We're talking about
Yeah.
thousands of men who are serving in the army, and it goes a long way to I think changing hearts and minds and allowing the beginning of gradual abolition in the northern states. So if you think about American history in the big picture, I think you could point to like three eras of U.S. history in which you could argue there's the most progress for Black
Right.
rights. So one is in the civil rights era, which follows World War II.
Hmm.
One is during and after the Civil War and into Reconstruction, where obviously slavery is abolished. And then there's also after the Revolution, in which slavery is abolished in the northern states. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those three big movements, abolition of slavery in the northern states, the abolition of slavery nationally, and then civil rights movement, all follow major wars in U.S. history, in that all three of those conflicts require like mass mobilization of society. You have to recruit from all levels of society to bring them into the war to help get enough manpower to win the war. And it's very hard to, I think, tell people who are putting their lives on the line for the country, well, go back to slavery or go back to Jim Crow.
Right.
And so it goes a long way in changing hearts and minds. In the case of the revolution, it's in it's in the northern states, which are not as economically dependent on slavery, where you see the emergence of an anti-slavery movement during the Revolutionary War, but really picking up, especially after the Revolutionary War ends. And so northern states begin phasing out slavery. It takes a long time in some places, but they begin phasing it out. And of course, Civil War, ends slavery entirely.
Right.
And then Civil Rights era, end of segregation, end of Jim Crow, Voting Rights Act.
All right. I got it. Now I have to read this. I wrote it down.
Okay.
But I think it was this between our semester break, but the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon awarded you a research fellowship to study the life and legacy of Horatio Gates,
Mm-hmm.
kind of a overlooked person in history. And so, what was that? Could you tell us something about Horatio Gates and kind of the research that you did?
Yeah, so in grad school, my topic is we're looking at loyalists in the Hudson Valley. That will be a book at some point. Hopefully, it'll come out next year.
Right.
But as that's more like in the refining and editing process now, I wanted to embark on like a new research project. And I always wanted to write a biography. Horatio Gates is somebody that I think is really interesting. So he's best known as being the general that won the battles of Saratoga, which is in upstate New York. In 1777. Sometimes it's called the turning point of the Revolutionary War, because that is when that's shortly when news of that gets to Europe. That's when France decides to join the war on the American side, which entirely changes the war, because now the British have to defend their whole empire against the French, whereas opposed of just focusing on rebels in North America. And strangely enough, there's been very little written on him, and I think he's been overlooked a bit because the biggest reason is he and George Washington did not get along. He and Washington did not like each other at all. They started off relatively friendly. They knew each other in the French and Indian War. Gates is actually born in England, but comes to America and fights in the French and Indian War. And they knew each other a little bit there. Gates goes back to England, moves to what's now West Virginia, was then Northern Virginia in 1773, settles there. And because he's so experienced in his military background, he comes into the army when the revolution begins. And he and Washington kind of get along at first, but over time, their relationship disintegrates for a variety of reasons. But probably the biggest one is that Washington thought that after Saratoga, Gates was part of a plot to overthrow him from command of the Continental Army and put Gates in position. It's called the Conway Cabal, which historians debate how real that plot actually was. But anyway, because Washington is so venerated in U.S. history, I think his and Gates's acrimonious relationship plays a role in why a lot of historians weren't all that favorable in their views of him. The Battle of Saratoga is kind of controversial too, because he and Benedict Arnold are like the two big American figures in that battle, and there were a lot of people who give Arnold the credit for winning the battle and denigrate Gates, and so there's some controversy there.
And may have been the only good PR Benedict Arnold had for quite a while.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, I mean, he was on the American side for another 3 years after that, but then he goes over to the British, and his legacy doesn't fare too well. And then at the end of the war, Gates leads an army in South Carolina. At the Battle of Camden, he gets absolutely crushed, and so it's like, you tried to overthrow Washington. You might not deserve credit for the battle you actually won. Washington doesn't like you. You got crushed in this battle in the South, and so his legacy, I think, was very tarnished by those problems. And I think the way historians have written about him throughout history is very it's kind of biased, because it's like he's going against Washington, right? And Washington's this great hero, and so I think trying to get a fresh perspective of his life and the fact that nobody's written a biography of him in decades makes it a good topic.
Looking at Washington, he's revered, but what was the real Washington like? Because it sounds like he was, sounds like like just this relationship with Gates. So he's kind of a little bit insecure in certain
Yeah.
areas. He's and he's a man. He's like a man. He's a man, not this like icon, legend, idol.
Who came from a rich, he came from
Yeah.
a rich, like plantation. I think they tobacco.
Yeah, so he's probably born to like what you might say is the top 10% of Virginia society. It's not like top
Right.
1%, but he's
Yeah.
he's doing pretty well. And then when he marries Martha, that's when he goes in the top 1% because she's
Yeah.
the wealthiest widow in Virginia. Yeah, Washington. I think you could say he's insecure at times. I would say he's whenever there's a biography of Washington written, it's pretty much always starts with something along the lines of like Washington's. He's a myth. He's this guy in marble. Let's try to make him real, and all historians try to do that because he is a little hard to get at, more so than like I think Lincoln is, for example. But Washington is, I think he's aloof in some ways. Being aloof is kind of 18th century style leadership. Like he believes in social hierarchy. I mean, he's a revolutionary, but he also believes in hierarchy. He doesn't like how his officers, especially officers in New England, like to hang out with the soldiers they're commanding. He thinks you don't want to fraternize with men below you.
Kind of an elitist.
Yeah, so he's an elitist in some ways, and after the war, when he's president, he'll be mostly aligned with the Federalist Party, which is the party of, you might say, more elitism. But at the same time, he is a revolutionary. He does have some good Republican principles. And when I say Republican, I mean like lowercase r Republican, not the modern Republican Party. But he has some good Republican principles. The most important thing he does, in my opinion, is that he steps down from power twice. He does that in 1783 at the end of the Revolutionary War. And think about the way that a lot of revolutions end. They don't end with democracy, right? Or republics. They end with dictatorships. And within like the general era of the American Revolution, you have Napoleon a few decades later, who who's also a successful general, seizes control of France, becomes first consul, and later the emperor. And Washington doesn't go that route. He doesn't go the route of like he could have, but he chose not to. So that's where he has good, I think, core principles about civilian government and representative government. So he resigns his commission at the end of the Revolutionary War, and then after the end of second term of his presidency, he'll step aside again. So that's the most important thing he does. In terms of like winning the war, he's maybe not the best tactician. I think actually, if you're going to say what he's worst at in terms of being general, is probably the tactical part of it. He makes mistakes in a lot of battles. He gets outflanked. He almost gets captured, especially on one occasion in New York in 1776. But he has fairly good strategic vision long term in terms of just keeping the army together to try to, because you just have to, the Americans kind of, in a way, they have a lower threshold of victory. They just have to not lose. The British need to reconquer this huge region. And he recognizes that, just kind of keep the army in the field and to keep up resistance. And then he's really good at like working with French allies, working with civilian leaders in Congress, working to get the army supplied.
Politician.
Yeah, he's a very good, like the political side of being a general, he excels at. The military part of it, he's not bad, but it's just he's not as good at that as he is at the political aspect.
Who were like the Pattons and MacArthurs of the Revolutionary War to help, because he's not the most effective military leader. He had to have others that filled in.
So I think if Washington, say, got killed in a battle, and you have to like pick somebody to succeed as overall commander, the most logical candidate is a guy named Nathaniel Greene, who's from Rhode Island, and he, at the end of the war, so actually after Horatio Gates is beaten in South Carolina, Greene is sent down to the South to try to defeat the British in the Carolinas, and he wins the Southern campaign. Like he oversees this really very well managed campaign against British and loyalist forces across North Carolina, South Carolina, and ends up forcing the British into Charleston and Savannah after they'd occupied much of the interior parts of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So Nathaniel Greene is probably one of the best like tactical leaders on the revolutionary side. I think Benedict Arnold is really, really good too, while he's on the American side. Daniel Morgan's another one, not as well known, but he
that's another name I'm not that familiar with.
Yeah, he ended up being a brigadier general by the end of the war, so he wasn't even a major general, which is like the top rank. But he plays a big role at Saratoga. He plays a big role under Greene in the Southern campaign in South Carolina. So he's important as well. So Greene, Morgan, Arnold are some of the examples, but there are other ones too. Those are just the ones that come to mind.
Important question. Washington, wooden teeth, yes or no?
No wooden teeth. So we had teeth that were made of a lot of different things. They were there was like some animal bone in there, also human teeth that were probably purchased from some of the enslaved people on his plantation.
Yeah.
So a lot of different things went into his dentures, but wood was not
I
one of
would have
them.
stuck with wood. It
Yeah,
sounds like a dog's breakfast of dentures.
yeah. I mean, back then, actually buying teeth
Yeah.
from people was pretty common. Because if you're poor, you have a good set of teeth, you want to make some money, you could sell your
Hey,
teeth.
there.
But Washington, I mean, dental hygiene in the 18th century was really bad. But
Yeah.
he had especially bad teeth. So he has, I think, like one tooth left in his mouth, one like original tooth in his mouth by the time he becomes president,
Yeah.
and he loses that while he's president.
Isn't
So
that why they never said for when they would paint them for their presidency, they never thought way later, right? Or was it by choice? I can't remember. Either way, they chose not to show their teeth.
I think that's part of it. Yeah, it wasn't like cultural practice to smile in paintings back then. But Washington, you could actually tell in some of his paintings, just like how his mouth is not in great shape. If you look really closely to like the shape of like his cheeks and things, like his
Yeah.
dental health is just really bad.
Yeah. Very. You have a book manuscript that "Suffering for the Crown,"
Mhm.
the Hudson Valley Loyalists, violence and forced migration in the Revolutionary North America. So that's the book you were talking about. That's in works. When will that be published?
Well, depends. I'm hoping before the end of next year. I think
Yeah.
that's the goal before the end of 2025. There's still some hoops to get through, but that's the plan. Yeah. So that was my dissertation that's evolved into my book manuscript.
So can you share what the kind of what the book will be about?
hmm Yeah, so it's about loyalists or colonists who support the British in the Hudson Valley of New York during the Revolutionary War. And it's a study of really like violence and forced migration. So thinking about the Revolutionary War, not so much as like British versus American, but American versus American.
Yeah.
So I think you can make a pretty strong argument that in many ways the American Revolution is the first civil war where you have
Yeah.
a pretty substantial part of the population that does not want to break away from the British Empire.
Right.
They want to remain part of the British Empire. And New York has a larger loyalist population than most other states,
Mm.
and as a result, there's a lot of violence and suffering in New York during the war.
Because yeah, I don't ever remember being taught that. It would, when I would be taught, it seemed like it was everybody was united
Mhm.
against British tyranny. But then I
Yeah.
guess what you see is that it wasn't not nearly that clean. It was a big group of people that really wanted to just stay part of the empire.
Yeah, society's fractured into many different groups. So I think if
Yeah.
you had to put a percentage on what part of the population is loyal, it's probably, I would say, somewhere around 15%, which
Yep.
might not sound like that much, but that doesn't mean 85% is pro-revolution because there are so many other people who are in the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
People who are either switching sides, people who are just trying to stay out of it entirely. So maybe like a slight majority of the population's in favor of the revolution, but it's never a huge majority. It's a very divided period of U.S. history, and one that I think Americans don't recognize as being so divided. It's easy to kind of tell a story of like this great patriotic
Yeah.
crusade of Americans against the British, but it's a really divisive period of U.S. history that has in I think in like New York and New Jersey, and then also in the Carolinas, it
Yeah.
really is like a civil war. We have patriots and loyalists fighting each
Whoa,
other,
yeah.
which civil wars are almost always more violent than conventional wars because you don't recognize the legitimacy of the other.
Yeah, and how would and I'm just trying to think like with Washington and his generals, how you go to battle with, you got loyalists and then the British. So it's kind of this triangular
hmm
war that you're trying to, win.
Yeah, because Washington, what he has to keep in mind the whole war is that he needs to win. He wants to win the battles, obviously, but he
Right.
also needs to win the hearts and minds because you don't
Yeah.
want too many loyalists because then you can't win the war.
Yeah,
And so Washington is very conscious throughout the entire conflict to try to win the hearts and minds of the
Yeah.
people, and that's another thing he does quite well. He's very conscious of trying to, keep local civilians as happy as they
Yeah.
can be under the circumstances. Try not to have soldiers go plunder people's farms and
Yeah.
things like that and turn them against the revolution. So he's good at that as well. But yeah, and the loyalists have a really, in some ways, I don't think all historians would like me to phrase it this way, but in some ways, they're one of the biggest losers of the Revolutionary
Yeah.
War. The British lost the war, but it's the whole British Empire.
yeah.
If you're a
They
loyalist,
go back home.
Yeah.
They're here. Was there any like reconciliation done with the Loyalists? I mean, trials or anything like that?
So once the war ends, loyalists really have two choices. One, they can try to reintegrate into American
Right.
society, or they can leave and settle in other parts of the British Empire. And the big spot many of them are going to go is to what's now Canada. But for those who want to reintegrate, which is a majority of them,
Right.
it's kind of tough the first few years because you have this really intense civil war,
Yeah.
and forgiveness doesn't come right away. It takes a few years, and it's harder in places where the war was worse. So places like New York, New Jersey, and again the Carolinas, where a lot of the war is the most intense, those areas reintegration's harder because people are not going to forget the bloodshed of the war so easily. And so like in New York and what I've studied, there are loyalists who try to come home after the war ends and the British army's gone, and they get beaten up by mobs, they get tarred and feathered.
Right.
The peace treaty ending the war says that the United States will not prosecute any loyalists, and they don't listen to that. They still
Right.
prosecute loyalists in many
yeah.
cases. So yeah, the reintegration is difficult, but within a few years, it actually pans out okay for the loyalists in the U.S. They have to kind of lay low for a while, but by you get to the late 1780s, so say 5 years or so after the war ends, for the most part, they've reclaimed their citizenship. And I think that's in part because it's not the only reason, but partly because for more conservative forces in American society who are like Federalists arguing for the Constitution, loyalists who are also more conservative can be pretty good allies if you want to create a more hierarchical government.
And they were landowners, right? And so they were able to keep their property and not have it seized.
Loyalists, you
Yeah.
mean? Depends. Loyalists are really diverse, so there's actually not much of like an economic difference between loyalists and patriots. You actually have a lot of very poor loyalists too. That's actually one of the most interesting things about studying loyalist demography or patriot demography is that you would expect to find some clear differences between loyalists and patriots, but there are a few, but there aren't that many. So like one difference, especially in the northern colonies, is that more members of the Church of England become loyalists, which is not surprising because the king's the head of the church. But beyond that, like you don't find a ton of consistent predictors in terms of loyalty or being pro-revolution. And during the war, many loyalists did lose their property. It varies by state, but
That'd be expected.
yeah, New York confiscates the most property, but many other states confiscate a lot of property too. And some of them manage to keep their property in spite of that, others don't. And actually, I think this is like my recommendation for anyone in grad school right now trying to figure out a dissertation to write. Someone should write something on loyalist land confiscation because like nobody's written the big book on that. So that's something I recommend somebody to write that.
There you go. What was the state of faith at that time? Because the top line is always that that was one of the things that people came to this country for freedom of religion, and I mean, and there may have been a point where all of a sudden it's like Washington had opportunity to become an emperor, and there's probably an opportunity to kind of create like our own Church of America, like Church of England, but but at that point, were all these, the loyalist patriots, did they have their different faiths, or how was it all dividing out by the end of the war?
Yeah, so the big thing is the Church of England in the northern colonies, more loyalists there. Actually, the southern colonies, it doesn't really play out that way. In the south, Anglicans aren't really actually that much more loyal than the bulk of the rest of the population, probably because they are the bulk of the population in the south. Yeah, so religious differences, Anglicans are the big one. At least in some of my research, I find that Presbyterians in many cases tend to be more pro-revolutions. Maybe that's like a thing for Lion to take pride in.
There you go.
More patriotic.
Go Scots.
That was actually my master's thesis. I looked at loyalists in one town, and I found the religious divisions and religious tensions of the community were like the big predictor between who's going to be a patriot, who's going to be who's going to be a loyalist. So yeah, but America is an incredibly diverse society in terms of religion, probably the most diverse place in the entire world. In the 18th century, you have so many different groups of people there because there are people who are coming for religious freedom, people are coming for economic opportunity in the colonial period. It's kind of a combination of things, but because you have so many different groups moving to America, you end up having like this real tapestry of religious life. So there are German Lutherans, there are members of the Dutch Reformed Church, especially in New York from when it was a Dutch colony. There are Congregationalists, which are kind of like Puritans in New England. There's a lot of Anglicans in the South. There's a lot of Presbyterians in the middle colonies. It's a very, very diverse society. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why religious liberty is kind of baked into the U.S. Constitution is that if if the federal government tried to favor one religion over another, it could
Right.
destroy the whole country just
Yeah.
because of how diverse it was.
Yeah.
So it actually kind of helps the U.S. go down a path of having more religious freedom, more religious liberty than
Mhm.
pretty much anywhere else in the world in that era.
Here at Lyon, you've also started teaching Arkansas history.
I have, yeah.
Kind of, you'd start from like the foundation of the state to present day, or is there a particular area you focus on?
I do all of Arkansas history, so I go way back. So literally to when the first
Yeah.
Native peoples arrived in Arkansas thousands
Mhm.
of years ago. That's where I begin. It's harder to do that kind of research because as a historian, you rely on like written documents, written
Right.
sources, and when you're doing history before the arrival of Europeans, you don't have written sources.
Mhm.
So it becomes hard. It's harder to do the pre-Columbian history, but I try to do that a bit, and then yeah, get into the colonial period of Arkansas history. There's Hernando de Soto, who's a Spanish explorer who came through Arkansas and through Batesville actually
Mhm.
in 1541. Get into like when Arkansas was kind of a French colony. There's a small French presence in Arkansas, and then into the American period where Arkansas becomes a part of Louisiana Purchase and
Yep.
becomes a state, and all the way up to the present.
Yeah. Was there kind of a sliding door moment where Arkansas could have been a very, very different state? Like, was there any pivotal times that the state went through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess a really pivotal period in its early history was the Louisiana Purchase, I would
Purchase, yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Arkansas is part of the Louisiana Purchase. If Napoleon doesn't decide to sell Louisiana to the United
Yeah.
States, I don't know what Arkansas is today. Like it's
Yeah.
probably something. It could be something very different. And maybe the U.S. acquires it later on, but then
Right.
Arkansas could take a very different form by that point. But yeah, U.S. doesn't acquire Arkansas until 1803.
Mhm.
So had France held on to Louisiana,
Yeah.
maybe Arkansas goes down a very different path.
Where, like, and I don't quite consider consider Arkansas like being like really a central part of the Civil War. As
Hmm.
far as for the South, they were. I mean, they were part of the Confederacy, yes, but
Mhm.
not not like the Confederacy. So they,
Yeah.
I mean, how did that play? How did that play out?
Yeah, Arkansas is important in the Civil War, and I'll preface this by saying I know less about the Civil War than I know about the Revolutionary War, but
Yeah.
I know a reasonable amount about the Civil
Right.
War. So I would say Arkansas is not it's not like the most central state to the Confederacy. I wouldn't say it also secedes later than
Mhm.
most of the Confederate states. So there are 11 states that make up the Confederacy. 7 of them secede after Abraham Lincoln is elected, and then 4 of them secede only after the war begins at Fort Sumter
Right.
in South Carolina. And Arkansas is one of the 4 states in what we might call the Upper South that
Sure.
secedes, along with Tennessee,
Yeah.
North Carolina, and Virginia after Fort Sumter. But Arkansas does see a significant number of battles because it borders Missouri, which Missouri is a border state,
Right.
meaning it has slavery, but it remains part of the Union. And Missouri is very contested during the war. And just being in the northern part of the Confederacy, there are going to be more battles in Arkansas
Right.
than some other states. The battles in Arkansas are definitely not like as well known as
Mhm.
say like I don't know Gettysburg or
Right.
Fredericksburg or Petersburg or some of the iconic battles of the Civil War. But the Battle of Pea Ridge is probably the most significant like military engagement to take place in Arkansas that really ends the ability of the Confederacy to try to take over Missouri, and that's like in March 1862. So yeah, I mean it's a small state within the Confederacy. I want to say it has the smallest population of any state besides Florida
Right.
within the Confederacy. So it's a small state, so it doesn't contribute the kind of manpower that maybe like Virginia or Georgia does, but it's still a constituent part of the Confederate war effort.
Yeah. When as a historian, they always say that history's written by the victors,
Hmm.
and it's not like history is like a defined set of facts, like a mathematic equation.
Right.
That it's set, so it's always kind of history's
Hmm.
changing. Uh, how how do you approach that as a scholar? Because Jason and I were talking beforehand about things like Thomas Jefferson. When you look at him, he's foundational as far as he's a president. He's part part of the creation of the country. But there's also a lot of complicated history
Yeah.
about him personally, and so you apply today's values in looking at it. Quote unquote, he gets canceled,
Right. Right.
but let's tear down that statue. Let's do. So how do you approach that as a historian? Because it's not as clear cut as it was 50 years ago,
Mhm.
where it just seemed this is the set of events and that's that.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely changed, even in the last, I'd say, 10 years or so,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
how like the public thinks about some of these figures. So I don't think there's like a uniform way of looking at it by historians. You'd ask different historians and get different views. So I don't know. My view is to kind of take somebody like Thomas Jefferson and do the warts and all approach. To look at the whole story.
Right.
What are the good things? What are the bad things? And what can we take away from his life and legacy? So I'm not going to advocate taking down like a Thomas Jefferson statue. I think there are plenty of things about Jefferson that we can honor and recognize and celebrate.
Yeah.
But remember the other part of the story too, which is that he did enslave hundreds of people in the course of
Right.
his life. He played a role in kind of being an intellectual founder of Indian removal, which is going to be
Yeah.
used by Andrew Jackson a few decades later to remove a lot of tribes from especially the American Southeast. So there are all sorts of different parts of Jefferson's story, and I think if there is a statue of Thomas Jefferson, we can celebrate him for, use that statue of celebrating his fight for religious freedom, his belief in
Mhm.
the importance of education. He believed that to have a democracy, you need to have a very well-rounded, very well-educated, well-rounded citizenry, kind
Yeah.
of like a liberal arts education in some ways, to stave off tyranny. He's a president,
Yeah.
espoused some very powerful ideas about human freedom, and that should be put in dialogue with the other parts of his legacy, which include being a slaveholder and include many other things that we would not find okay today at all.
So it gets complicated.
Yeah, I think like if you look back in the past and you're expecting to find everything to be very nice and rosy and find really
Right.
really I don't know, like if you read a history book and you come away feeling like, "Ah, that story ended just the way it should have." It was
Yeah.
probably a very bad history book. Like it's just that's not how history is. History doesn't end the way
Right.
you want it to do. It's complicated and messy. But I think it's helpful to understand people can have different legacies. People
Yeah.
are complicated and people can be multiple things at the same time. They can be heroic in certain aspects of their life and really awful in other aspects of their life.
As a
Dramatic change of subject. I want to ask
fire.
about specifically about Thomas Jefferson. So when do you think because he had the opportunity when he was writing the documents, United States. Do you think like the argument always is he didn't put in the ending of slavery, abolishment of slavery, because he
Mhm.
was afraid that he wasn't going to get enough people to support, like the cause of
Right.
seceding.
Right.
Do you believe that that would have been the case? Like we wouldn't have been unified if we would have put in the abolishment of slavery and like our declaration against the against the king.
When he was reading the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence was not like a document that could legislate like things to the states. The states still were controlling themselves. It wasn't like there wasn't anything legal he could do in the Declaration of Independence. He did include a clause in the Declaration of Independence initially in his initial draft, which he condemned the slave trade and actually blamed the British for starting the slave trade, which was kind of an interesting and I think maybe not very
Convenient.
genuine way of framing it because the white American colonists benefited immensely from the slave trade. Would it be possible if someone like Jefferson or Washington put their credibility on the line in that period to try to end slavery? Would it have happened? I think you never know for sure, but I think probably not because it's just so wedded, especially in the southern states. It's hard, counterfactuals are hard, so I can't say
Yeah.
that with absolute certainty. But I think it would have been difficult. But if it was going to happen, probably 1776 is more likely than by 1787. 1787 when we had the Constitution. By that point, I think if the northern states had insisted on abolishing the slave trade, or that we didn't compromise on the 3/5 compromise, which made it so that each enslaved person counted as 3/5 of the person towards representation in the House. Had the northern states not compromised on those issues, I do think the South probably would have gone off and established its own country. It would have been
Yeah.
So it just would
very
have been
hard.
a civil war about 70, or I guess 100. No, about 80 years before
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, a few generations earlier. Yeah, I think the way that slavery ended in the U.S. Nothing in history is inevitable. But I think the way that slavery was most likely to end in the U.S. was through war, and that's how it ended. Because the U.S. is a huge country geographically, so you have half the country that is really dependent on slavery and half the country that is not. And for the half the country that is dependent on it, they were not willing to give it up without a fight. Now, the Revolutionary era is interesting because in the Upper South, at least, like in the in Virginia, for example, or in Maryland, there is some murmuring about is slavery the right thing? And someone like George Washington actually does free his slaves in his will. And there are other slaveholders in the Upper South who do the same thing and free slaves in their will because they're troubled by the institution
Right.
and don't really like it. But the further south you go, that sentiment gets weaker and weaker. So you get down to like South Carolina or Georgia, that sentiment is very, very limited. See, Upper South is kind of like the wild card in the mix, like
Right,
where they're like
right,
a
yeah.
little more skeptical of it, but even still, Virginia, Maryland have slavery until the Civil War, so they were dependent on it for a long
Yeah,
time.
and with us being so young as a nation, do you think like Civil War at that time would have been terrible because of how fragile we were? Do you think that kind of would have imposed like another like quick like try to reclaiming from the British by chance, like maybe starting a second revolution in a way?
Yeah, I think if the U.S. was weakened by a civil war, that opens the door for European powers to
Yeah.
intervene in the United States, in North America. That doesn't mean if a civil war manages to end slavery 70 years early, it's still, I think, the right thing to do. But
Right.
but if the U.S. did fight a civil war and ends up weakening itself, that could open the door for the Spanish or the British or the French to exploit those weaknesses and expand their holdings or establish more holdings in North America. And that's actually one of the interesting things about how the American Revolution plays out, because the American Revolution in the 1770s, 1780s, and then just a generation later, there are the Latin American revolutions all across Latin America. And Latin America doesn't really unify, right? It kind of fractures. Whereas in the U.S., we have this some ways very fortuitous way the revolution plays out, where the country stays together.
Yeah.
There's a civil war eventually, but it stays together. But it's not too hard to imagine had things played out a little bit differently. You could have a bunch of different countries. Maybe New England be its own country. Maybe the
Yeah.
middle states be their own country. Maybe the old West, like the old Northwest, like the Midwest would be its own country. It's not hard to imagine that happening had just a few things gone differently.
Uh, as a expert in the Revolutionary War, movies and television,
hmm
kind of what did over your life, what TV or movies have got it right, and then what have got it like comically wrong?
Well, comically wrong is a much longer list. So I'll start with
Start
I'm
there,
going
yes.
to start with the short one, the ones that got it right. So
Yeah.
I think the best movie in terms of historical accuracy that I think is quite good is something called Mary Silliman's War. It is not very well known,
Yeah.
but it's about a woman in Connecticut in the Revolutionary War who her husband's a leading patriot. He ends up being kidnapped by loyalists and brought over to British occupied New York, and she spends the whole war, or much of the whole movie, which is I think at least over the course of a few months, if not a couple of
Yeah.
years, trying to get her husband back from captivity
Mhm.
to Connecticut. I think that does a really good job of showing like the internal tensions within a community between patriots and loyalists, and kind of like the social history of the war that's going on while the sort of outside the big battles,
Yeah.
what's happening in everyday life. So that one, Mary Silliman's War, is really good. I would recommend watching that. It's pretty short too. It's more like a TV movie instead of a feature film.
Mhm.
Other one, it's not a movie, but I think it's pretty good, is John Adams, the miniseries
HBO.
by HBO. It came out like 15 years ago. That's not it's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good. Like
Yeah.
it's you could watch that and learn things.
Right.
And the list of things that's like the two I would say that are pretty good. The other list, like the ones that are wrong, it's a long list.
Let's fire away.
But the first one, the best known feature film about the Revolution, is The Patriot
Yeah.
with Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
And there's a very famous early American historian named David Hackett Fisher, who I think it was the time the movie came out. Somebody asked him about it, and he was being interviewed, and he said, "The Patriot is the history of what Godzilla is to biology." So it's not very historically accurate. Like they get basically everything wrong. I don't even know where to begin with that. It's just like they show Mel Gibson as like a white guy from South Carolina who has like black men voluntarily working for him. He's not
Yeah.
a slaveholder, which is very, very, very strange.
Yeah.
The battle scenes are really bad. Like they don't make any sense.
Yeah.
They basically combine different battles into one at one point. They take two battles that took place at different times in the South, combine them into one. And they're like, the battles are so historically inaccurate. I mean, they show Mel Gibson taking out a British column with a tomahawk or something, if I remember correctly. It's just like he kills like 20 British soldiers with a tomahawk.
Yeah.
Loyalists are basically non-existent in the
Yeah.
movie, except for like one guy. And loyalists were a huge part of the British war effort in the South, because the British moved south towards the end of the war, and by that point they're fighting France and Spain across the world, and so they can't allocate as many troops to America anymore,
Right.
and so you can tap into loyalist support. So in the Southern campaign, loyalists are instrumental to the British war effort, and they're not there. So I could go on, but that's just a bad movie for historical. I mean, in terms of just watching it, it's entertaining.
But there's more out there. Give us What's another one?
There are other ones. Another one that is it's a TV show. It came out a few years ago now, maybe 10 years ago, called Turn, and it's based on a spy ring that Washington and the Continental Army set up in New York City. So the British controlled New York City almost the entire war, and this British spy ring, this American spy ring, was kind of based in it's based in Long Island, which the British also controlled, but they're like setting out information from New York City and Long Island to Connecticut to revolutionary peoples over there, and so it's based out of a town called Setauket in Long Island in particular. But anyway, that I like that in terms of just watching it, but they kind of just make things up at times, things that never happened. And also, like, the main spy in the TV show gets caught like 7 times, which is like makes him like the worst spy ever. He's getting caught 7 times, and they're like not a whole lot is known about the spy ring, and they're clearly I think trying to fill the gap when they can in terms of the history. So that's not a great one either. I mean, it's good. I like that in terms of just watching it, but in terms of like learning things, not great. I think the way they depict Benedict Arnold's really bad in that TV show too. There's that. There really haven't been that many movies or TV shows on the Revolution, which is surprising. But another one from about maybe 25 years ago now is called The Crossing. It's about Washington crossing the Delaware, and that's like I think it's better than The Patriot, but it's not a very high bar to set to be better than The Patriot. Just have to be like not terrible. So there are a lot of things wrong with that movie too. You'll learn more from that than The Patriot, but there's just so Jeff Daniels is the actor who plays Washington. I'm not crazy about how he depicts Washington. I don't think it's very historically accurate. The battle scene, the Battle of Trenton is not great in there. There are a lot of things that are wrong along with that one too. So I could go on, but I think the American Revolution is ripe for somebody to make a feature film on. You got the 250th anniversary coming up in 2 years, the Declaration of Independence. I mean, somebody should do it because you have all these Civil War movies, all these World War II movies, and there are some good World War II and Civil War movies, but the American Revolution just doesn't really have that much, which I think is unfortunate.
Well, Jason's an aspiring screenwriter, and we may option Suffering for the Crown, and and coming to Netflix soon.
Yeah, make a movie on loyalists and the Revolution. There you go.
There you go. Yeah. But last thing, this is a podcast about careers, and what career advice would you give to students who want to major in history, and then what career options are available for history majors?
Yes, I think there are a lot of really good things about majoring in history. So one thing that's great about it is it gives you good research skills. You're going to write research papers. You're going to go through databases. You're going to use primary sources. It's going to improve critical thinking skills. I think critical thinking is sometimes like an overused term, but it really does improve critical thinking skills in terms of interpreting primary sources, putting them in dialogue with secondary sources, and thinking about complexities in history, like how do we understand complicated figures? How do we interpret evidence that contradicts other evidence? Things like that. It's going to help with writing skills too. Even though we have AI writing now, I still think writing skills are important, and history is going to help you develop writing skills. It gives you historical context, so putting the whole world in context, what I mentioned earlier, which is one of the reasons why I like history. It just how are you going to solve? This is not American history, but if you're going to try to solve, let's say the crisis in Korea between North Korea and South Korea, how do you solve that without understanding Korean history and the history of the North Korean state and the Cold War and all that? In terms of like career paths you could take with history, this is like one of the challenges that history faces where I remember even when I was in school majoring in history, I get comments like, oh, what are you going to do with that if you don't teach? Teach high school. Teaching high school is one option. I think that's the one that people most often think about. That's something you can do, but it's far from the only option. So a lot of people who have history degrees will actually go to law school. So those writing skills, research skills are really
thinking, all that thinking.
That's really important in law school. So if you look at like what people are majoring in who go to law school, history is still near the top. It's not at the top. It's near the top of majors going to law school. You want to work in like libraries, for example. Having history background is good. Transitioning to library school when you're done with undergrad. Working in archives is another option. Museums. So museums always have a lot of history majors there. It's also like you can take history and use it in other areas too. If you want to work in the corporate world, having those research skills and writing skills and putting things in context are all really important. So there are a lot of things you can do with history. It's like this uphill battle I think historians are dealing with that's taken place across the country really in the last 15 years since the recession, 2008, that people have kind of moved away from a lot of the humanities and a lot of social sciences into more hard sciences, which I'm not saying people shouldn't major in the hard sciences. I just think there are benefits to majoring in history, and there are students out there who I think would like to major in history, but they're worried about the career opportunities in a way that that are not reflected in the wide variety of things you can do.
Real good. That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Kieran.
Yep, thanks for having me.
All right, and thank you, everyone, for listening to the Career Pathways podcast. We come to you weekly, and as always, we always wrap the show up with producer Jayson telling us, where can you find the Career Pathways podcast?
You can find the Career Pathways podcast almost everywhere on 99.97 platforms. The exact number of terms are different.
That's how precise we are at the Career Pathways studio. So once again, thank you, Kieran.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jayson. And thank you all for listening to the Career Pathways podcast. Please join us next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.
This broadcast is sponsored in part by Lyon College and by KILT Studios.